Minister. Leave is granted. I call the honourable member for Warringah.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The Standing Committee on the Environment and Energy was tasked with inquiring into the climate change bills that I presented in November last year. And the committee received over 6,500 submissions and had 3 public hearing days with some 49 witnesses appeared. And witnesses and submissions were over 99.9% in support of the approach proposed in the bills. As part of the process, the committee reports on the inquiry to the Australian Parliament. And this is really important because we desperately need to have a sensible discussion around climate change policy and emissions reduction away from electioneering, where it becomes a point-scoring exercise between both major parties. But I must at least start by thanking the committee members for their hopefully open mind to hearing the evidence and hearing from so many across Australian civic society who want better policy on this. To the Secretariat, who I know worked incredibly hard dealing with the vast amount of submissions, and especially to all those that have participated in the inquiry that made the submissions, both individuals but also organisations. This was vitally important for so many organisations to be on the record for how global warming and climate impacts and all the risks associated are going to impact their sector and what they need to see from the government, from the opposition, by way of good policy. It was unfortunately not possible to reach bipartisan agreement on the Chair's final report and recommendations flowing from the inquiry. And sadly, whilst this kind of inquiry should be capable of bipartisanship and a coming together on such an important policy issue, what we saw was still a divide along political party lines. And despite the evidence received being overwhelmingly in support of the bills, all government members of the committee refused to incorporate the full extent of the support in the main report, even from a point of view of referencing the evidence, but also in relation to recommendations that were put forward to either progress the bills, but also progress the development of Australian climate policy. Now, Prime Minister Scott Morrison has on a number of occasions stated that Australia would not be told by the international community what Australia's climate policy should be. And the member for Fairfax again reiterated the need for liberalism and policy and that this should be left to the Australian people. But here was the opportunity to listen to a really broad section of the Australian public, the Australian civic society, environmental groups, business groups, industries, unions, health professionals, on what is needed by the government to address the policy issues of climate change. But still, the government members on the committee were not willing to acknowledge that better policy is needed in Australia. It was still a question of maintaining the line that we are going to meet and exceed and we are doing enough. Deaf to the cries of so many and the pleas of so many that this policy area needs to shift. It needs to move away from being a political football to an area of consensus, like we have consensus on major health issues, like we have made consensus on issues of defence. So it really is a question. It is disappointing, and it was disappointing for so many, that in fact that political partisanship could not be set aside for a moment to progress this policy area. I believe many members of the coalition, in particular the member for North Sydney, are in fact embarrassed by the position of the government and their own failure to act on climate change. And through the whole committee process, members like the member for North Sydney were looking for excuses not to support the approach proposed in the bills. They were looking for reasons to go against the recommendations. And even the member for Fairfax, in presenting the report just now, talked about a major reason being that we couldn't hand it to unelected experts to advise government on what good policy should look like. It's just strange, this approach when it comes to climate change, to take issue with unelected experts advising government when for the last 18 months, The government has followed the advice of unelected chief medical officers in its response to COVID, and it has had no qualms in imposing restrictions and following the expert advice and establishing an unelected COVID committee for a coordination committee.
For Warringah, the Minister has a call.
Mr Deputy Speaker, leave was granted on the basis of speaking about the report. It's the members' contributions are now straying a little bit away from the report, the committee's deliberations and how they've reached them. So I'll just perhaps call on the member to bring her remarks back to that and perhaps wrap up her contribution.
The member for Warringah has the call.
Well, I thank the Minister for that, but I would note this was the very point the member for Fairfax made in his speech. The reality is we do need to listen to the independent experts on this policy area. The overwhelming submissions in response to this inquiry wanted that. The main report and the lengthy dissenting report makes clear the evidence established the demand and the need for clear policy on this area, that a risk assessment, a national risk assessment needs to be done, that we need clear adaptation plans to address that, and we do need to legislate our pathway to net zero so that the business community, the investment community, industry, but also working communities that currently are facing a very real and significant transition know what that pathway will look like. Putting our heads in the sand will simply not resolve this. So this inquiry was vitally important. These bills are needed now more than ever because the government does not have a clear policy in this area. The bills, the subject of this inquiry and of this report are based and very much modelled on conservative policy in the UK. They are a demonstrated model that works. And I urge the government to look at the recommendations and implement clear policy that responds to the clear need that was identified during the inquiry. It is evidence from organisations like the Business Council of Australia, the Australian Industry Group, the Australian Medical Associations, and so many in our communities, that they want clear policy. They do not want divisive policies around this. The core elements of the bills establish that the 5 yearly budgets for emissions reduction be established. And that is something that provides policy certainty that is desperately needed for. We know that our international trading partners are all committed to this. They are moving forward. And whilst it is vitally important as we move towards Glasgow and COP26 that we progress Australian policy. This bill, put forward as a private member's business bill, was done so with the goal to actually bring together both sides of politics for the benefit and future of Australia long term. This is an area of policy that desperately needs partisan politics to be put aside so that for the good of the nation, the good and the safety of Australia long term, we have clear policy. It is an existential threat. As the member for Fairfax made clear, climate change, the risks, global warming, these are existential threats. They are existential threats from a point of view of our environment, but also our economy. The cost to the economy will be so large. It does not bear thinking about the impact to future generations if once they have the burden of the last 2 years with the COVID pandemic, on top of that, leaving them an unresolved burden of climate change and global impacts. These bills seek to put in place a sound framework to address these challenges. And I really urge government members and coalition members to really take on board what their legacy will be if they fail to embrace sound policy that needs to happen. We are seeing it at state level. We need to see it at federal level. This report, ironically, paves the way as we approach an election for more independence to try and put forward solutions that are simply not stuck in political partisanship. So I thank the committee for its work. I express my disappointment that coalition members of the committee were not able to put aside political party allegiance and actually address and engage the very real issue of climate change and the need for a clear policy to reduce our emissions. Thank you.